Great. All right. Now we have all the panelists suddenly appeared from backstage. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Good morning or good afternoon, whatever it is. Good evening in China. My name is Svetozar Minkov. I'm professor of philosophy and director of the professor of philosophy at the Roosevelt University and director of the Leo Strauss Foundation. We have a panel on Alberto Ghibellini's Leo Strauss and the Recovery of Natural Philosophizing. Alberto is going to begin with some remarks, but let me just introduce quickly everybody else here. Alberto has a PhD in political philosophy and he teaches philosophy of law, maybe in the University of Turin, and his wine has been featured in many prestigious journals, including the Wall Street Journal. We also have Professor Stephen B. Smith, Alfred Cowles, professor of political science and professor of philosophy at Yale University, author of many books in political philosophy and history of political philosophy. Daniel Tanguay, professor emeritus at philosophy at the University of Ottawa and author of Strauss's intellectual biography and other articles on Strauss, also articles on Pierre Manon and Marcel Gauchet and Alain Renaud. And we have Bernhard Traut, also of the Strauss Foundation, and a professor of chemical engineering at MIT and a director of the Benjamin Franklin program there. So we'll begin with a short presentation on his own book by Alberto himself. Welcome.
All right. Can you hear me well? Once again, very good. Okay, so thank you so much, Zarko. Thank you, everybody, Professor Smith, Daniel Tanguay, and Bernard, for giving me this opportunity to discuss my book with you. It's a great pleasure and a privilege for me to be here. And of course, thank you to the Leo Strauss Foundation for organizing this event. So, Professor Minkov suggested that I begin by explaining the main intention of my book. This, correct me if I'm wrong, is my task, as you wrote in the email. So let me try to do that by saying that Strauss is one of the strongest opponents of historicism and positivism, or value-free social science, because he regarded them as unbearable forms of relativism. I believe that on this point, there is almost unanimous agreement among Strauss scholars. And another point where there is almost unanimous agreement among scholars, among Strauss scholars, is that in order to counteract this kind of relativism, which was represented by historicism and value-free social science or positivism, he didn't embrace a strongly metaphysical perspective, because he regarded that kind of metaphysical perspective, strongly metaphysical perspective, as too dogmatic and ultimately incompatible with any form of genuine philosophical thinking, as distinct from theological thinking. Because philosophical thinking is characterized by a totally free questioning and inquiry. once said that philosophical thought must be fearless and shameless, at least as far as thinking is concerned, as distinct from the communication of the results of the philosophical inquiry. But as far as the inquiry itself, that's the case. So he is indeed against any form of dogmaticism. And for this reason, it is fair to describe him as a skeptical. He even regarded Plato as a skeptical author. In a very interesting letter he wrote to Carl Löwit, he once said that so-called Platonism, meaning, I understand, a more metaphysical interpretation of Plato's perspective, represent a flight from Plato's problems. So once again, he was against dogmaticism from a philosophical perspective, and his position can rightly be described as a form of skepticism. My point is that in order for this kind of skepticism to perform the function Strauss attributed it, that is, to counteract the relativism which is embodied by historicism and value-free social science, this skepticism cannot be a form of radical skepticism, because my understanding is that the end result of this perspective almost amounts to the end result reached by relativism. And for this reason, relying on a definition that Strauss gives himself, that we all tend to regard his skepticism as a zetetic skepticism. Now, what's the difference between the two? Well, zetetic skepticism, as the adjective zetetic from zeteo, Greek term, verb, which means I search, I investigate in order to find out something. So in a meaningful sense, this zetetic skepticism, unlike a radical form of skepticism, claims to be able to lead to a genuine philosophical investigation. And this, in Strauss's view, as far as I understand, means at least that it is able, it claims to be able to find out some problems which can be described as fundamental and permanent problems. This is how Strauss defines them. And the reason why they are fundamental and permanent is that they are problems coeval with human beings qua human beings. So it is indeed skepticism, but a skepticism which is meant to enable a genuine form of philosophizing. And so in order to better understand what this means, to go back to the main task of this introduction, which is to explain the main intentions of my book, perhaps the most important intention was to better understand what is at the basis of this form of skepticism, zetetic skepticism, enabling genuine philosophizing as distinct from radical skepticism. And by relying on Strauss's writings, both published and unpublished, in the book I make use of often of the letters or published writings that have been only posthumously published. I think that we can find a good answer regarding the question of what enables that kind of zetetic skepticism when we emphasize that Strauss regarded the concept of nature, of what is by nature, as key in that perspective, as what is fundamental in order for genuine philosophizing, meaningful philosophizing to be possible in the end. And in this perspective, in this case, I must admit, especially by studying Strauss's writings from the 1930s, I also found a very interesting way to define precisely genuine philosophizing, which is natural philosophizing, natürliches Philosophieren in German, because most of the writings from that time are in German. And so the question arises of what is at the basis of this kind of natural philosophizing, that it is important to notice Strauss tend to strictly refer to the Greek original approach. And indeed, it is the question of nature, of what is by nature as the fundamental concept, but especially when we look at the Strauss's critique of Hobbes, we can also notice that another key factor in this natural Greek philosophizing is that it takes its orientation from speech. So that's the way Strauss puts it in his book on Hobbes. So what does it mean? Well, if we read that book in particular closely, we can see that it means ultimately to resort to a sort of Socratic dialectics, whereby by starting from the logoi, the opinions characterizing the city, the political sphere, the philosophical investigation, once again, by means of dialectics, at least tries to meaningfully raise the question of a standard, which is understood as a standard given by nature and not by convention, of course. And so I believe, once again, it is fair to say in an objective sense. And in this perspective, the city, of course, is ultimately Plato's cave. And it is interesting to observe that Strauss defines, from this perspective precisely, Plato's cave as the first natural cave. Natural, I understand, precisely because it enables that kind of genuine natural philosophizing, which is the Greek philosophizing. And beside this, and this is another point extremely important I try to focus on in my book, he also mentions a second cave, a cave beneath the cave, or a pit beneath the cave. But what is interesting for us to notice is that in this case, he describes it as a second unnatural cave. And the question is precisely, the reason why it is unnatural in his view is that it doesn't enable, like the first natural cave, precisely that kind of natural philosophizing, which I've tried to describe previously. So another main goal of my book has been, and is, if you read it, to better understand the difference between these two caves, the reason why the second is natural, and the first is natural, Plato's cave, the first natural cave, whereas the second is unnatural, and why the second doesn't lead to a genuine form of philosophizing. I think I can stop here as a general introduction, and I'll be now very pleased to hear the comments, and I'm sure that we'll have the chance to dig deeper into these differences and other things
dig up.
will come up. Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, Professor Smith.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'd like to begin by thanking Alberto for writing a truly original and provocative book on Strauss. At a time, frankly, when I was beginning to think there was not much more of interest to say about Strauss, Alberto, along with his fellow countryman, Carlo Altini, has shown that there are still fresh ways of exploring Strauss's thought that don't fall into the usual cliches and recriminations. So yeah, I think that's been an extraordinary accomplishment. And let me also thank Svetozar for organizing this webinar, for the great work he's done in editing and compiling a number of Strauss's texts that had not previously been collected or were not previously available. It's also a pleasure to be sharing this webinar with Daniel and Bernard, who I've not seen for a while. Alberto's book does what to my knowledge, what no previous study of Strauss has really attempted to do, which is to put the concept of nature and natural right front and center. This has always been one of the most enigmatic aspects of Strauss's thought. What did he mean by nature, or more specifically, natural right, as suggested in the title of his most famous book? The term natural right is itself something of a mystery. There is not only the question of what the term means, but how it is different from better known expressions like natural law, whose greatest exponent was Thomas Aquinas. Strauss once called him the chief of the kingdom of darkness. And with the even better known expressions like natural rights, most famously expressed by John Locke and then repeated almost verbatim in the Declaration of Independence. Strauss's early editors at the University of Chicago Press must have been aware of this connection because of the facsimile of the Declaration of Independence used on the cover of Natural Right and History. But interestingly, the flyleaf of the original cover, hardcover edition of the work, contains an image of the scales of justice. It was only later in the paperback edition that the facsimile of the Declaration appeared. The text of Natural Right and History was originally presented as a series of lectures, inaugural lectures at the University of Chicago in 1949, shortly after Strauss's arrival on campus. And it was not published as a book, an expanded version, until 1953, several years later. 2 points I want to make about this. The book that appeared now, over 70 years ago, Natural Right and History, has never gone out of print. This is pretty amazing when you consider the shelf life of most philosophy books that, relatively speaking, have a pretty short run. I once attempted to convince the then editor of U Chicago Press, the great John Torneski, to issue an expanded edition of Natural Right and History that included Strauss's original lectures. I can't really remember the reasons, probably questions of length, but it was decided not to do this. But I would like to suggest to Zarko, maybe at some time, trying to find if we can find a way of publishing Strauss's original lecture versions of Natural Right and History, and maybe in some future collection of his work. The context of Natural Right and History is certainly worth mentioning because Strauss mentions it himself. That context, rather, is the recent victory of the Allies in World War II and the onset of the Cold War. A little more about this later on. The struggle over natural right is presented as part of a struggle for liberal democracy over its 2 great competitors, German National Socialism and Soviet communism. Strauss worries in the introduction, or at least pretends to worry, that the aftermath of the war has seen a decline in the belief of natural rights in favor of a purely historical consciousness. He interprets this as the victory of German historicism over traditional natural right. This would not be the first time, he warned, that a nation defeated on the battlefield had imposed on its victors the yoke of its own thought. It is interesting that Strauss, a German refugee and a fairly recent American citizen, presents himself as the only person capable of saving America from itself. I am reminded of a sentence from Tocqueville, where he comments on the problem of the tyranny of the majority. Only foreigners or experience, Tocqueville says, can make certain truths reach the ears of the Americans. It seems as though Strauss thought of himself as doing the same thing. The concept of natural right remains in many ways Strauss's most noteworthy idea, and also, again, one of his most mysterious. Alberto associates it mainly with the idea of the best regime or the best way of life. By associating natural right with the best regime, he distinguishes it most markedly from the Thomistic idea of a natural law, that is to say, a comprehensive moral code binding on all human beings, as well as from the modernist idea of natural rights that attempts to carve out some sphere of basic human freedoms. Natural right, in the singular, by contrast to both of these alternatives, points to the peak of human experience, our perfection, or the philosophic life as the one thing needful, to use one of Strauss's favorite words. Strauss almost single-mindedly seeks to vindicate the life of philosophy as something of supreme, almost superhuman achievement. Writing at a time when philosophy was being confined to the humble task of ordinary language analysis, his heroic model of philosophy, not as a body of doctrine, but as a way of life, marked a return to a classical problem, namely, what is the best way of life? And yet I must admit that I have never found his idea entirely compelling. There seems something self-serving in the claim that the philosophic life is best. As I have written elsewhere, only philosophers ever seem to say this. No one ever hears the plumber or the electrician making that claim. If philosophy is a supremely important human activity, something worth doing for its own sake, as I believe it is, then what does it add to say that it is somehow best? I want to argue, though, that there are two other conceptions of natural right that compete with this one, which I would like to call attention in the remainder of my remarks. One appears twice in Natural Right and History. On the bottom of page 31 and the top of 32, Strauss refers to, quote, those simple experiences regarding right and wrong that are at the bottom of the philosophical contention that there is a natural right. And on page 105, he appeals again, almost in the same words, to simple experiences that are at the bottom of natural right doctrines. These two statements are supplemented by a comment in his restatement on Xenophon, where he says that man is a being who possesses an awareness of, quote, sacred restraints. All of these suggest a kind of experiential or phenomenological ground of natural right, that they are grounded in certain kinds of primordial human experiences. He does not elaborate either on what these simple experiences of natural right are, or what kind of sacred restraints they prohibit. As examples, though, of these simple experiences, I would allude to the two biblical passages with which he uses to preface Natural Right and History. One from Nathan's rebuke of David's treatment of Uriah the Hittite, and the other about the attempt of Ahab to buy or appropriate Naboth's vineyard. Both of these are stories about the abuse of kingly power. When is it ever right, Strauss asked, for a rich man to steal from a poor man? Rather than speaking to some peak of human experience, then, natural right seems responsible for certain elementary conceptions of justice and injustice. But there is a third conception of natural right that I would like to to which I would like to call attention, that appears in the context of Strauss's discussion of Aristotle's Ethics, Book 5, Chapter 7. Here is a prime example of what Strauss elsewhere calls the specific immunity of the commentator in order to expound on a purely textual problem. For aficionados of Straussian hermeneutics, I would add the passage in question occurs at the dead center of the book, suggesting that it may present the core of Strauss's natural right doctrine. The passage in question concerns whether there is a single natural right that holds for all times and circumstances. Is natural right unchangeable? Or Aristotle said, fire burns here and in Persia? Or is natural right like our systems of weights and measures that vary according to habit and character and context? Strauss ascribes to Aristotle the view that natural right consists not in general rules, but in concrete decisions made under the force of circumstance. There is no general law that applies everywhere because no one can define in advance what a society may need to do to ensure its survival. Let me allow Strauss to speak in his own voice. A decent society, he writes, will not go to war except for a just cause. But what it will do during a war will depend to a certain extent on what the enemy, possibly an absolutely unscrupulous and savage enemy, forces it to do. There are no limits which can be defined in advance. There are no assignable limits to what might become just reprisals. But war casts its shadow on peace. The most just society cannot survive without intelligence, i.e., espionage. Espionage is impossible without a suspension of certain rules of natural right. But societies are not only threatened from without, considerations which apply to foreign enemies may well apply to subversive elements within the society. Unquote. There is more than a hint of Carl Schmitt here in Strauss's discussion of unscrupulous, even savage enemies, which it should go without saying is not something that ever appears in Aristotle's comments, nor does Aristotle make any reference to espionage or other techniques of modern intelligence gathering. Strauss's references not only to foreign enemies, but to subversive elements within society is an unmistakable reference to McCarthyism, then in full swing in the United States. How much of this did Strauss support? Rather than taking these issues head on, Strauss prefers what he elsewhere calls one of his characteristically Victorian niaiseries. Let us leave these sad exigencies covered with the veil with which they are justly covered, he remarks. Strauss clearly realized that this discussion of natural right courted Machiavellianism. How does one distinguish between extreme measures that are justified because of circumstances and extreme measures that are not? He remarks that this distinction between just and unjust actions remains, quote, one of the noblest duties of the historian. But just how we make this distinction is left unexplored. I mention some of these passages and some of the different meanings of natural right only because I'm not sure that they appear in Alberto's book, and I would be very interested to hear some of his thoughts about them. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. Daniel Tanguay.
Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here and to discuss with you about this important book, and I'm very glad for the invitation. Thank you very much. Alberto Ghibellini's book is part of a body of scholarship on the thought of Leo Strauss, which has emphasized the importance of examining the young Strauss's works in order to grasp the intentions of his thought. While Strauss' early American disciples had not totally neglected the philosopher's German works, they had not devoted to them the attention they deserve. Moreover, it should not be forgotten that Strauss' important correspondence with his early friends, Jacob Klein, Gerhard Krüger, Karl Löwit, as well as several unpublished texts, were only made available at the end of the last century in the edition prepared by Heinrich and Wiebke Meyer. This edition has enabled a more precise study of the origin of certain central elements of Strauss's thought. However, one can still debate whether or not the mature Strauss remained entirely faithful to his youthful philosophical intuitions. Alberto seems to me right to believe that it is necessary to make the detour via Strauss' early works and also not to refrain from generously employing his correspondence unpublished text from the 20s and 30s of the last century in order to better define the contours of his original philosophical project. He is not the first to take this path, but his short work stands out from other similar attempts for its great clarity in fierce determination to get to the bottoms of things. It is also a work of great erudition. He knows German well and the cultural and philosophical context in which Strauss's thought emerged. His knowledge of secondary literature in the debates surrounding Strauss' thought is also remarkable. Above all, I appreciate in this book the sobriety and probity with which he presents his interpretation. It is also very courageous in pointing out some highly problematic aspects of Strauss' thought, for example, in his fine analysis of the philosopher's relationship with liberal democracy, which does not fail to resonate in today's political climate. I must leave this aspect aside as it does not touch the core of the book. I will be closer to this core, however, if I return to a question I've already debated in the past with Alberto, namely that of the exact nature of the cave beneath the cave. He devotes some excellent and instructive pages to this subject in the final chapter of the book entitled The Pit Beneath the Cave and the Problem of Natural Right. As Alberto demonstrates, the young Strauss project was to rediscover the natural condition of philosophical questioning, i.e., the condition where the fundamental question, the Urfrage, of how should I live or what is the right life, can once again be freely asked. To describe this natural condition for philosophical inquiry, Strauss uses the Platonic image of the cave. As everyone knows, this allegory describes man's natural condition as that of a prisoner who knows nothing of the world except the images shown to him by mysterious puppeteers. The images are the equivalent of the opinions we have been taught. The allegory then evokes the courage and determination required of the prisoner to emancipate himself from his opinions and to undertake the ascent of the rough and steep path that leads from the semi-darkness of the cave to the full light where he can contemplate the reflections of truth. Strauss would later say that this Platonic cave must be understood politically. The cave is that of the city and its laws. For Greek philosophy, then, the starting point of the philosophical ascent is man's natural political condition. The dialectics of philosophical ascent would consist in separating what is conventional from what is natural in the opinions of the city. It is the primary level of philosophical reflection, which Strauss sometimes calls the naive, that he wants to rediscover, as Alberto has said in his introductory comments. But if it's to be rediscovered, it is because it has been lost. And this is where things get complicated and interesting. Strauss argued that we moderns live in a cave beneath the cave, and that our first task is recovering the original meaning of philosophical inquiry, will to be emerged from this second cave into the first cave, or in other words, to overcome the artificial obstacles that prevent us from philosophizing naturally. It's therefore essential to understand what exactly this cave, our cave, and what obstacles stand in the way of us remembering our forgotten natural states. It seems to me, at the risk of sounding facetious, that in the second cave, we can distinguish three levels or even three different caves just under the first natural cave, which are certainly closely related, but which do not present the same challenge in terms of the effort of emancipation required to liberate us from their darkness. I believe that these three levels can be found in Alberto's analysis, but I'm taking the risk of oversimplifying his presentation in order to highlight the radical character of Strauss's philosophical proposal. The first level of the second cave is that of historicism. Historicism is taken here as the dogmatic position that derives from the multiplicity of conceptions of life and values, the proof that there can be no standard defining the good life, which we would be forever prisoner of our historical condition, and the only task left to us is to describe as accurately as possible, as Strauss says, the interior decoration of our cave, without being able to pronounce on its quality. I'm not going to repeat Strauss' arguments against historicism here. They're well known, and Alberto confirms that they were already present in these early texts. What I would say is that in general, when we speak of Strauss's second cavern, we are referring to this historicist cavern. Alberto indicates rightly, however, that the young Strauss was thinking of something more original than historicism when he alludes to the second cave. This is the meaning of Strauss's phrase, the second cave, as the cave of modernity. Historicism is, of course, part of this second cave, but there is an intermediate level of the second cave, so to speak. The level of the struggle at the birth of modern philosophy to emancipate itself from revealed religion, the struggle against the prejudices of superstition in order to return to nature. Note that I say quite precisely in order to return to nature. So, according to Strauss, modern philosophers made a genuine effort to recover the ground of the first cave. To complete this task, they had first to overcome the obstacle represented by revealed religion. And yet, Alberto aptly describes Strauss' main reason, explaining the failure of the moderns. They were never really able to rediscover nature because they remained entangled in what they claimed to refute, namely the religion of revelation. In a quasi-dialectical way, they retain in their conception of nature religious elements that had not been expunged by their desperate effort to find a natural ground for the philosophical quest. It's this complex dialectical movement that I once tried to explain, indicating that Strauss, in his reflection on the origin of modern philosophy, embraced what I call then a weak version of the secularization thesis, which Alberto brilliantly takes up and develops in all its consequences. I haven't done that. Alberto has done that. Thank you. In this respect, Nietzsche's deconstruction of modern ideas play an essential role in Strauss' understanding of the origin and the shortcomings of modern philosophy. In Strauss's eyes, Nietzsche was the last Aufklärer, having revealed that modern philosophy was nothing more than secularized Christianity. If we take into account the failure of modern philosophers to return to the natural plane of philosophy, it's because there is, in fact, a major obstacle standing in the way of any attempt to begin the ascent from the second cave to the first cave. This obstacle is the existence of a region based on the belief in an all-powerful creator God who has given a law defining what human beings should believe and how they should act. We have now reached the deepest level of the second cave, the third level, where the most powerful obstacle to a return to the first seems to lie. Could even be this deeper level is itself the real second cave. The second cave will not be the cavern, the cave of historicism or the cave of modernity, but the cave created by the emergence of a specific form of religion that radically oppose the natural philosophical endeavor. The most formidable opponent to the return to natural philosophy wouldn't be then historicism of modern philosophy, but instead reveal religion. This is the way how Strauss put it in his second book, Philosophy on Law. I quote, "The fact that a tradition based on revelation was introduced into the world of philosophy added to the natural difficulty of philosophy, which are given with the cave existence of man, the historical difficulty." End quote. If this is indeed the case, any return to the natural mode of philosophizing would require overcoming the historical difficulty represented by the revealed religion. So my first question to Alberto is this. Does he think that, according to Strauss, the second cave is indeed the revealed religion? If his answer is yes to this first question, this would lead me to a second, even more difficult question. If the second cave is the revealed religion, a return to the natural condition of the philosopher would require, first, a refutation of revealed religion. Now it seems to me that such a refutation would require the metaphysical exclusion of the possibility of the existence of an omnipotent God, i.e., the ultimate truth of a metaphysical system, such as Spinoza's or Hegel's. He knows as well as I do that Strauss has not been a great believer in metaphysical systems, and we can even characterize as post-metaphysical his phenomenological effort to recover the natural state of the philosophical questioning. Alberto knows, again as well as I do, that Strauss himself judged the constitution of a complete metaphysical system to be impossible, assuming that the part constituted by the human being could not think the whole from the point of view of the whole. Strauss thus strongly rejected the idea of philosophical wisdom à la Hegel or à la Kojève, which means that the philosopher, devoid of any ultimate metaphysical certainty, can never be perfectly sure of the rightness of his choice in favor of reason. The philosophical rationalism defined by Strauss can only be a weak rationalism, and for this reason, the justification of philosophical life in the face of other choice of existence can never be total and definitive. Alberto is not without knowing that I have always resisted to any form of Straussian dogmatism of exclusivism that feeds the pride of vanity of those who believe to be possessed by philosophical mania. I've been always more interested in the zetetic Strauss that took seriously, carefully examined the different possibility answers that have been given to the question of the best life. The Strauss who staged the great quarrels of poetry, philosophy, ancient and modern, Jerusalem and Athens, philosophy and politics, and didn't try to settle them too easily by resorting to the magical incantation of Greek wisdom. I dare to believe that this Strauss is not just a figment of my imagination, and I console myself with the thought that there are many other Strausses on the market, also perhaps born of imagination other than mine. in any case, I had the impression that Alberto ultimately reject the zetetic Strauss in favor of the Strauss more assured of the power of reason, and if I believe his conclusion, in possession of what he described as a metaphysical interpretation, however weak and residual. I regret that Alberto did not develop his final consideration in the conclusion further, for I, though, have long since abandoned Strauss' quest for this untraceable metaphysics, I'm still open to being persuaded of its real existence. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, Alberto, I think you can respond to these and before we launch into a bigger discussion.
All right. Thank you. I should rephrase what you just said, Zarko, and say I will try to respond because well, the main issue after hearing comments so well developed and punctual is to find a way to address, if not all, the questions that has been raised, at least the most important of them, without leaving aside very important points. So I need to apologize in advance because I'm aware that my reply is not going to be entirely satisfactory, but let me try. So thank you for both to Professor Smith and Professor Tanguay for their comments. And let me begin with Professor Smith's comments and questions. So let me start from the final point he brought up, the Schmittian interpretation. Let me summarize it that way: the Schmittian interpretation of natural right, meaning that we can find another interpretation of natural right according to which ultimately necessity rules. And so even though we can believe, as Strauss seems to believe, that there are limits that can be sensed or of which we can be aware as human beings, we come to a point where these limits must be ignored because they become impossible to abide by, so to say, if we want to at least ensure our survival. And well, that's a very important point. I myself addressed that point in a chapter which should have been part of the book, but I decided not to include this chapter in the book in order to prevent some overlapping. I have published this article recently in History of European Ideas, and it is entitled Leo Strauss, a Political Realist, ? And well, as far as precisely that interpretation of natural right, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, but around the quotation you have read, Strauss also raised the point that even though sometimes necessity is what ultimately leads us to act in a certain manner, it is our duty not to accept necessity as the final rule, so to say, and we should try to at least shape our conduct and our choice in terms of the best way of life according to a ranking which is not a ranking of human hands that is dictated by necessity itself. So necessity is indeed very relevant, very important, especially in the political sphere. But as far as natural right, we should also consider, if not, as you correctly put it, an omnicomprehensive law, like a moral law, like according to Thomas Aquinas, we should at least regard as important a sort of ranking of the human goals, of the human ends. And I understand this reference, not in a strong teleological sense, but at least in the still somewhat teleological sense, although in a weaker manner, that we should at least try to justify our choice for certain lives. And in this case, I think that Strauss's main focus was on the philosophic life as the best life, the best possible life. Well, in this regard, I think that it is important what I said earlier regarding genuine philosophizing, because I understand that our ability to re-enable that kind of genuine philosophizing, which is rejected by relativism, historicism, positivism, or social value-free social science, is also the presupposition in order for us to fully vindicate the choice of the philosophic life. So the philosophic life is an entirely meaningful life if philosophy itself is meaningful. And in order for philosophy as a human pursuit to be meaningful, I believe that we must take into consideration very carefully what Strauss says regarding natural philosophizing. My question is, can we entirely defend the choice for the philosophic life if that kind of natural, genuine philosophizing based on what is by nature, based on the orientation from speech, isn't available? So that's another point I wanted to make. Another relevant question I was able to write down was regarding the different meanings of natural right. And so in particular, I take this question pointing to the meaning of natural right in the ancient classical sense. Well, I believe that, as I tried to show in my book, that in this case, we can claim that natural right in that sense, which seems to be Strauss's sense, lies, so to say, in between natural law, understood as an objective, omnicomprehensive law, moral law, and natural right as it is understood in modernity, so as a freedom. If we think of Hobbes, and as he defines right as distinct from law, we can easily understand that. And Strauss was, of course, as a Hobbes scholar, always ready to emphasize it. So natural right is not a freedom in that case, according to the classical ancient meaning, but it is not moral law either. So what is it? I think it is the attempt to answer the question, what is by nature right and just? And so it is understood in an objective perspective without leading to a fully developed moral law. And I think, once again, that this has to do with the idea of a ranking of the human goals or of the human ways of life. even if this kind of natural right cannot tell us what we should do in each and every given situation, we can still have a sort of ranking which may perform the function like of a sieve in order for us to understand what is best in that given case. And even if sometimes necessity requires us to act in a manner which is not necessarily the manner serving that higher goal. But nonetheless, for this reason, I think the historian can justify in hindsight, so to say, because there is a ranking of the goals whereby the historian can say whether an action prompted by necessity was justifiable, was noble or not. And this presupposes that kind of view, which is, to my understanding, related to, I tend to define this view in my book, a weakly or residual metaphysical view. Because in the end, I find behind this perspective the attempt to save, to keep some of the traditional philosophical perspective. Once again, I think that it has to do with the difference between a form of radical skepticism, which comes very close to relativism, and a form of zetetic skepticism. Let me see whether I can add another point regarding, well, the scales of justice. I was very interested in that reference rather than the U.S. Declaration of Independence. Well, the latter stands for the rights understood in the moral sense, in the modern sense, whereas the first, I take it to represent a more objective approach. And I think that this, in terms of symbols and images and covers in this case, may be taken as a confirmation that my interpretation of natural right in the classic sense is not far from Strauss's own view of that topic. Well, let me know if I have forgotten to answer very, very urgent questions. I will be very pleased to try to answer your points in greater details. If you send me the paper you have read, I would appreciate this very much, to keep it, but also to try to see whether I can articulate my thoughts about your points in better than I've been able to do right now. So let me come to Professor Tanguay's comments. Once again, thank you so much for these comments. They are extremely relevant and stimulating. And in this case, I have a text. So thank you for sharing a previous version of your comment in advance. This is going to be helpful in order for me to answer your points better. So first, let me start from the question of the different layers, so to say, of the second unnatural case. You mentioned the fact that there is a first layer, which is, by the way, the one that critics more often focus on. And that's the layer represented by historicism. And of course, that's a very important one. And I would say, as the most superficial of the three you mentioned, it is the one easier, which is the easiest of the three to be understood and detected. But I think that you are absolutely right. Also relying on what Strauss said about the second natural cave in the writings where he deals with this very important topic, we can indeed literally find the mention of a cave of modernity. I think that's in the intellectual situation of the present, as well as in, if it is not precisely mentioned like that, it is implied in philosophy and law. And then there is the very important question of the even deeper basis of those two layers. And you said that this third deeper layer, the deepest of the three, can be regarded, perhaps, this is your suggestion, as revelation itself. Well, regarding this final point, there is the quote from Maimonides, Strauss often refers to, which openly mentions, well, actually, not literally, but it is clear that what added some artificial or historical difficulties that weren't present in Greece is the encounter with revelation. So to some extent, I believe that it is indeed correct to maintain that revelation itself is at the basis of the creation of a second unnatural cave. This said, I'm not sure that it would be entirely correct to say that revelation itself is the cave. So revelation and the encounter between revelation and Greek philosophy is what triggers the descent in this second unnatural cave and represents the lowest layer, so to say. But the cave is a situation in which philosophy finds itself. So I would say that perhaps I would slightly rephrase what you said by saying that revelation is the cause of the second unnatural cave without being itself that cave. And the element of the second unnatural cave leads me to believe this. Why am I saying so? Because Strauss is clear in mentioning the fact, in saying that unlike the first natural cave, the Platonic cave, whose element is represented by appearance and opinions, the second unnatural cave is characterized by prejudices. And already in Spinoza's critique of religion, so in the 20s, he emphasized the fact that prejudices are historical concepts because they, strictly understood at least, they are ultimately the result of the inception of revelation in the world of philosophy. And so this inception, this encounter, turns what used to be opinions, even endoxa authoritative opinions into something new. And this something new is what he describes as prejudices. Now, in this case, I think that there is an important point to make, because we can understand the difference between and the nature of the prejudices in two ways. And I think that both can be found in Strauss's texts. And the first is quite easy, I believe, to understand. So rather than being opinions debated about or shared by the political community in the city, after the encounter between philosophy and the tradition of revelation, the authoritative opinions become even more authoritative in that they are revealed. And so the fact that they are revealed by an omnipotent God makes them even more authoritative, so to say. So it becomes more difficult. In this sense, there are additional artificial or historical difficulties that are added to the normal, natural difficulties of philosophizing, because there is this shift from, let's say, normally authoritative opinions to revealed authoritative opinions, God-given authoritative opinions. But I also believe that there is another part of Strauss's reasoning in this regard, which is extremely important, in order to understand why the second cave can be described as unnatural and why it no longer enables that kind of natural philosophizing, which is ultimately the Greek philosophizing. And once again, I think that I try to show that this has to do with the concept of God's omnipotence, but rather than affecting, so to say, only the way whereby the opinions are conveyed, so as God-given, in this case, there is also an influence as far as the content of those opinions are concerned, so to say. So it seems to me clear that Strauss wants to emphasize that genuine philosophizing, not accidental, natural philosophizing, is possible only when we have that concept of nature, which is a Greek concept. This concept as something which is available to contemplation, as something stable, is destabilized by the idea of God's omnipotence. And the result is the unavailability of the object of the philosophical investigation itself. And in this regard, in the book, I emphasize two aspects of especially the modern approach. One has to do with theoretical philosophy or natural science, and it is the phenomenalist or idealist turn of those science and philosophy. And it is clear that Strauss links that turn to the need, which is a new need that the Greek didn't have, to shield themselves from the hypothesis of an omnipotent and or inscrutable God, depending on whether he refers to Descartes or Hobbes. But this is pretty much the case. Whereas another important feature of what I'm trying to explain, I hope that my point is clear enough, is the decisionism which is at the basis of Hobbes's view. And Strauss, in chapter 5 of my book, if not mistaken, I try to emphasize this. is very clear when he, in Origin of Modern Political Thought, by the way, an essay by Strauss we can read thanks to Zarco, who has edited this essay along with other essays by Strauss. So there, Strauss emphasizes clearly that there is a shift from a view of law understood as what is given by reason. So in this sense, of course, a stronger paradigm of reason. And because it is rational, it is regarded as a law, because it is right by nature, we might say, and a new view of what is law, which is Hobbes's view, that is based on the view of law as a command, as the result of the will of the legislator. And Strauss is very clear in emphasizing the fact that this new version has to do and is ultimately the result of Hobbes's inheritance of that view of what is a law from the biblical tradition. So that concept of God and of God's omnipotence is at play in the content of the opinions, in this case, of the prejudices modern philosophy in this case has to face. And so it is not just a matter of an authority which is stronger than previously. It is also a matter of the content of the foundations of the philosophical inquiry that are changed as a result of the encounter between philosophy and revelation. And let me see whether I can add another point quickly. So you asked me two questions, specific question. Do I think that according to Strauss, the second case is, okay, I've already answered this. I think I tried to answer this. If the answer is yes, if the second case is indeed a revealed religion, a return to the natural condition of the philosopher would first require a refutation of revealed religion. Well, that's a very important question, and I think it is, at least to me, impossible to answer this in a final manner. This idea of the refutation of revelation is made by Strauss himself in the autobiographical preface to the American edition of Spinoza's Critical Religion, at least by implication, but openly in Reason and Revelation. That point that philosophy needs to show that revelation is impossible to reject, to refute revelation, is made openly. So an answer to your second question might be yes, even relying on Strauss's texts. I believe that there is also perhaps a different attempt in Strauss's texts, especially earlier texts. And it is, and I devote some space to this parallel attempt, let's say, or previous attempt. I think even though it is not something belonging to the 30s, because there are mentions of this even later in Strauss's books. And I think that it has to do with the attempt to use Heideggerian destruction, which I often translate as deconstruction rather than destruction, I'm not sure that was a good choice, but in order to explain that it is not simple destruction. It's a way to how do you say, unbuild the concepts in order to go to the roots. And so I think that there might be, and I think there is, in Strauss's books, can also be found the attempt to employ this Heideggerian tool in order, by precisely historical deconstruction, to, if not to go back to the Greek origin of philosophical inquiry, to show that that was the truly natural setting for that inquiry to take place. And I'm not sure that this amounts to a refutation in the stronger sense you meant in your comment, but I think that it was meant as an attempt at least to restore some latitude for philosophical inquiry in that original sense. And another point, final point, perhaps, regarding your mention of the phenomenological approach characterizing Strauss as an entirely post-metaphysical. Well, I have myself thought a lot about this. I think that phenomenology is indeed an important element in Strauss's approach, as far as the second cave is concerned, as far as the attempt to rehabilitate a natural philosophizing, and so on. I'm not entirely sure that in his personal interpretation, this phenomenological stance can be regarded as truly entirely post-metaphysical. So that orientation by speech that Strauss, for instance, in his book on Hobbes, mentions as fundamental, he says, even to restore the question of the standard, not only in order to answer this question, but just if we want to ask meaningfully this question, we need to go back to that approach, which was Plato's approach, Socrates' approach, and so on. So it seems to me that that reliance of speech, that taking orientation by speech, if it is entirely phenomenological, it is not entirely post-metaphysical. So it is an interpretation of phenomenology which is not entirely anti-metaphysical. Some residual metaphysical elements must remain, because this is what I understand, the standard whose question can be raised by dialectically discussing the opinions is not meant as something contingent, so to say. So Strauss didn't want to say, oh, we should start from the opinions of the political sphere, the city, which is the Platonic cave, and by means of dialectic, raise the question of the standard meant as an objective standard, but each and every political sphere, each and every cave has its own standard, so to say. So he meant that as a way to raise a meaningful, genuinely philosophical question. And this makes me think that if this is phenomenological, I'm not sure about that, but I should know more about phenomenology than I do, but it is not entirely post-metaphysical. This is my understanding. Final point, I wish I could have expanded the conclusion of my book better than I did, but at the end of the book, I was, how does one say, depleted of forces. I didn't have any energy left. So I decided to leave it as it is now.
Thank you very much. I think we have some questions, but Bernhard Trout had a question.
Thank you. Yeah, given the short amount of time, we decided that I wouldn't make any commentary, but would just pose a question. And it's a question I think that wasn't raised here, but also was not raised at Harvard during your presentation and discussion there. And actually, you're mentioning your conclusion is probably a good springboard for that. And this is the question of exotericism in Strauss's writings and presentation. Of course, it's Persecution in the Art of Writing. It's very much of a whole study on that topic. You mention it in particular in your conclusions. So I wanted to maybe then go back to the rest of your book, where maybe this isn't quite fair, but I at least got the impression that you were attempting a clear presentation of some aspects, very important aspects of Strauss's thought. Within that clear presentation, however, with some exception, I don't think you delved into the manner of presentation in the letters, in the speeches, essays, so much. And I got the impression, and tell me if it's wrong, that you may have implied that Strauss indicated that the moderns, when publishing their work, Spinoza, Hobbes, for example, did so without a full understanding of the effects of revealed religion or the problem of revelation in mind. Time is short, so I won't go into any detail, but at least my impression is that Strauss didn't think that was the case from his writings, but I'm not a Strauss scholar per se. I might be wrong on that. So focusing on your book and presentations on your book and the topic, what do you think about that question of the moderns and knowingly addressing the issue of revelation as such, and the issue of exotericism in the works that you have analyzed of Strauss?
Yes, thank you, Bernard, for this question. It is indeed extremely important. Let me start from the final part regarding whether the moderns were aware of all the aspects implied in their confrontation with revelation, or whether they were to some extent unaware of some processes like which could be referred to the paradigm of secularization, the secularization theory. I think that in the book, at least, not only in the conclusion, but especially in chapter 5, the one about the politicization of philosophy, at the end of that chapter, I emphasize the fact that later in his life, Strauss became more determined in showing that the moderns knew entirely what they were doing, so to say. And he wanted to interpret that their philosophical perspective, intra-philosophically, if I'm not mistaken, is the term he resorts to. And that would imply a rejection of the secularization thesis, even in a weak sense, as Daniel. By the way, Daniel, it is I who thank you for using that expression. I try just to develop that insight. It is also true that previously in his studies, he openly resorted to that theory. In his book on Hobbes, for instance, he explains some of Hobbes's view, resorting to secularization as a reason why Hobbes held some views and not others. And so I think that it is difficult to tell whether he was entirely convinced, and this is, if I do not remember wrongly, the conclusion of that chapter. So while emphasizing an intra-philosophical interpretation of the modern views, especially later in his life, he was also nonetheless ready to admit that some of their views were shaped to some extent, at least. He says, elements which should be traced back to a religious view only collaborated, but indeed had a role. So I think that he was trying to strike a balance between an entirely intra-philosophical explanation and an explanation which in the end has to imply some form of, no matter how weak, secularization theory. If this is not the case, Strauss is, which might be the case, I'm not saying that it is not possible, but in order for us to entirely understand intra-philosophically, so to say, the modern perspective, we should accept that, for instance, the distinction between ancients and moderns, Strauss so often refers to and emphasizes, is actually pure rhetoric. We should be ready to admit that many very explicit things he says in some unpublished materials, including private communications to friends of his, were meant exoterically. So another thing we should be ready to admit is that the idea that the philosophy is an open possibility, that it is the best possible life, and that this should not be just an assertion based on mere subjective preferences, but something that can be vindicated to some extent, is not true. That philosophy is ultimately Strauss's noble lie, as Stanley Rosen put it. So it is indeed possible to interpret, and that's the gist of my conclusion, which is pretty short, but at least about that part, I hope clear enough. It is indeed an open possibility that his attempt to restore reason is more practical than theoretical, so to say, and so on and so forth. But the Strauss, if we do so, if we accept that interpretation, the Strauss we will have at the end, the Strauss we have at the end will be almost unrecognizable. And so I'm very, very hesitant, but can one say that? In embracing
Hesitant, maybe.
Hesitant. Thank you, Bill. In embracing this kind of reading, it is possible, but unlikely. That's my understanding. I do not believe that exotericism can turn everything into ultimately a form of radical skepticism, which would be unable to entirely justify the choice for the philosophic life, because this is my understanding, if we accept that kind of radical skepticism as distinct from zetetic skepticism, at least as I interpret it, yes, the end result would be the impossibility, the meaninglessness of the philosophic life understood in that genuine sense. And I think that this would be too dear a price to pay for us and perhaps for Strauss himself. But this is the price we should be ready to pay in order for us to accept that view, according to which when he was sounded more metaphysical, so to say, he was arguing exoterically only.
We have, we have officially ended I mean, Strauss ran over all his classes, so we can thank the panelists, but if you're willing to take some any more questions from the audience, or I have some questions, and a little more informally in the after party, just for a couple 5 or 10 minutes, we can do that. And of course, everybody.
I will be pleased to try to answer questions that may be raised, if I'm able to do so.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, let me just at least take one question from the audience. There's Mr. Chen. Let me. I think I will allow him to talk for a question.
Hi, Alberto.
Hello.
It's nice to
Hello.
meet you again after all these years. I remember our days at Harvard when we were also discussing Strauss, and I really like the fact that you have published a book on Strauss after all these years. Congratulations. So I would like just ask a question for clarification purposes. Um, again, I have not read your book, so I'm really curious about how you go about describing the content, the details of the so-called second cave in Strauss's formulation. I'm particularly concerned with the political dimension of this, the implications of the second cave, because to bring our whole discussion around Strauss back to politics, which is sort of his starting point. Strauss was really, again, concerned with a range of issues in the politics of his day. And as he saw it, most of these issues had roots in the political philosophy that gained dominance, I think, since the French Revolution. And it's striking to me from my reading of Strauss's writings that he really does much to show that how the presuppositions of the most important philosophers of the Enlightenment in the 18th and 19th centuries paved the way for the kind of politics that he saw in his time, and which also had an effect on people's reading of pre-modern philosophy. To give a case in point, there's a passage in Strauss's studies in Platonic philosophy where he speaks of how the philosophy of the French Revolution will be underlying the French Revolution and later German idealism affected the way people read Socrates and Plato's dialogue, especially the Euthydemus. I quote that famous or that striking passage, quote, "We're still too much inclined to see the conflict between Socrates and the Sophists in the light of the conflict between the thinkers of the Restoration and the thinkers who paved the French Revolution or took its side. In the Euthydemus, Socrates takes the side of the two brothers against Ctesippus and Criton. Socrates was not the mortal enemy of the Sophists, nor were the Sophists the mortal enemies of Socrates. According to Socrates, the greatest enemy of philosophy, the greatest sophist, is the political multitude, i.e., the enactor of the Athenian laws." So I bring this passage up because it seems to me Strauss is pointing to a very crucial fact about the intellectual climate of his own time, namely that the newer philosophies in modern centuries did so much to shape scholars, even common people's way of thinking, that they have no way of understanding the older original issues. So I wonder, I mean, in your book, did you go into detail about the exact kind of theoretical constructs that were created by modern philosophies, which were responsible for preventing a true return to these original problems. Thank you.
Well, when I addressed the question of the second cave, I tried to rely as much as I can and as closely as I can on the essays or books where Strauss mentions this topic. And so I believe that the answer to your question to begin with should be yes. I tried to give some details about that part, closely relying on what Strauss says regarding the difficulties that characterize the modernity in particular, their inability to raise the genuine philosophical questions, and so on. As far as the political part of your question, there are some parts where what you said is addressed, including Strauss's own political stance. I believe that if my understanding of natural right is not entirely wrong, as I said, it is regarded by Strauss as something objective, even though it doesn't lead to the understanding of a full developed moral law. There is this idea of a ranking of human ends given by nature, and this has, of course, political implications. It is at odds with the modern interpretation based on subjective rights. It is somewhat at odds with the view at the basis of liberal democracy as a result. And I think that this different of approaches, to put it mildly, is represented well and expressed well in some of the letters Strauss exchanged with Carl Levitt. And you can find an attempt to comment those letters, emphasizing the conservative tendencies, not to say reactionary tendencies, in Strauss's approach. At the end of chapter 2, if I'm not mistaken, entitled Ancient Liberalism versus Modern Liberalism. This said, I also emphasize as clearly as I can in that chapter that it is absolutely nonsense to regard Strauss as an ultra-modern thinker in the sense of someone who wanted to support a revolutionary perspective from the right. Even though there are some letters written by Strauss in his youth where he appears to be somewhat fascinated by fascism. If we look at the period where he underwent the so-called change of orientation, and especially some of the letters he wrote to Kruger in that very period, around 1930, it is crystal clear that he soon distanced himself from that approach, which ultimately has to do with Nietzsche, and started to look for a different solution, even politically, which is epitomized by the Platonic approach. This said, it is not a democratic approach. This is my understanding. Understood in a moral sense, it is much more conservative, even reactionary, perhaps, but it is not at all revolutionary from the right in that ultra-modern sense.
I mean, even the after party has to end. If Dr. Vega can ask one brief pointed question and get an answer, then we'll probably, that'll be the end.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, I hope you do. Okay. Thank you very much for this presentation, Professor Ghibellini. So my question has to do with Heidegger and the role and influence that he might have had in the 30s, particularly in Hobbes or Strauss's book on Hobbes. So, well, my question is if there is some influence beyond what you have spoke of as phenomenology and the destruction. I'm thinking particularly in what he calls the passoimnis, or the omission in well, what Heinrich Meyer has quoted in his introduction to the third volume of the Gesammelte Schriften. But even beyond this omission of Hobbes' question of the on the best way of life and the right regime, there are some notes, for example, in this preparation text for Hobbes' book, for example, this Position, and he ends this kind of a scheme by saying, well, he says in German, I'm sorry, inwiefern diese Kritik auch gegen Heidegger zutrifft. And he uses some concepts that, to understand Hobbes, but which are particularly Heideggerian, for example, the exposedness, the Geworfenheit, I don't know how they translate that into English. So my question is if you have given any thought to this relation between Heidegger and Strauss, but in the frame of Hobbes' interpretation during these years.
Well, I should say that I have, but I believe that they haven't surfaced enough in the book. But I can tell you that with Professor Minkov, we have debated a project which has to do precisely with the unpublished manuscript Strauss devoted to Hobbes, where there is the omission you mentioned. And so indeed it is an important part. Perhaps it is a gap which has remained in my book, and I look forward to the opportunity to fill this gap. This said, I think that this question relating in particular Heidegger should be asked to someone else, starting from Professor Smith, who has devoted a chapter on that very topic. So I would leave it at this. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, we can wrap it. I was just reminded at the end of What is Political Philosophy has a very simple and direct reference to technology. And then he says, is technology the natural situation? That Yves Simon had taken it for granted that various medical interventions to extend life and to delay death were part of the vocation of man. And Strauss chose to end that book with a questioning of that, the naturalness of technology. It was a more specific, it's not on the level of omnipotence of God or anything like that. It's a more specific way to speak of the artificiality of the modern, namely technology. medical technology in particular. That's okay. That made reminded of Heidegger. Great. Well, thank you very much, everybody, and Alberto and Professor Smith, Professor Tanguay, Professor Trout, and we'll hope to see you at another event in the near future.
Thank you so much.
See you.
It has been a great pleasure.
See you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.